Welcome back. All right, let's do this with Brandon Vogel now. We'll change gears and talk Nebraska football. He's the managing editor for Hail Varsity at Brandon L. Vogel on Twitter. Brandon, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. How are you guys?
Good, man. Good. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Feels like Big 12 got underway with its media days last week, and the SEC circus kicks off this week. So it feels like a new season is officially beginning.
Yeah, and Big Ten media days, of course, taking place next week. Let's start right there because we kind of just came off the topic of Northwestern football again as that resurfaced yesterday. Brian Kelly saying was that at SEC Media Day?
Yep.
That a coach needs to be aware of what's happening in his locker room. And now even looking at who Nebraska is sending, right, to media days. You have Piper, you have Reimer, you have Sims. What do you think is the overall thesis of the message that people will hear from Nebraska at media day next week?
It's interesting with Sims, as a transfer and as the presumed starter at quarterback. Matt Rule's Nebraska is the only Nebraska he knows. So I suspect you'll get a little bit different from him. I think for veterans and two in-state guys in Piper and Reimer, there'll be a lot of kind of compare and contrast, which is always difficult for those players to do, but it's what people are interested in. So I expect you'll hear a lot about, media days are always interesting. It's ultimate optimism part of the calendar, and it should be. Everybody's 0-0 to use a cliche, but I think that'll be it. I would be surprised, in the players that were selected themselves, it felt very consistent to me with what we've seen from this staff through the spring and summer. I mean, Luke Reimer, I think, was a player that Matt Rule mentioned in one of his very first press conferences. Ethan Piper has been a player who has come up a lot through spring football. And then Sims, we only got to hear from him, I believe, once during spring football. But kind of the narrative around him is really highly touted recruit, was a major get for Georgia Tech, was their starter for 3 seasons, when he wasn't injured. But he's somebody who has pro tools and pro potential. But if he had elected to go to the draft after this past season rather than transfer and try something else, probably would have been pretty borderline. I mean, perhaps very borderline. So the pitch there is, hey, I was just in the NFL. You could be, I think, a starter in this league. Let me help you get there. So it's interesting that you've got kind of 2 holdovers plus a new guy.
Brandon, how important with the guys that they selected to go to media days, do you think it was that they are kind of on the same page, or at the very least speaking the same language that Matt Rule has been sort of preaching throughout his first several months here on the job?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the primary reasons they were selected. Obviously, you want, I think, team leaders, but players that you don't even have to worry about them staying on message because it is the message for those guys. And media days gets a little wild at times. The Big Ten actually, in comparison to some other leagues, really gives you a lot of time with the players. There's 45-minute breakout sessions where players are at individual podiums. And, you get 20, 30 minutes into that, and the questions start to get a little bit wild. So you got to have guys who are capable of handling that. But what Nebraska didn't do, and I don't know that most teams do this, but it may not be. I don't think you want to go into selecting, well, who's the 3 best sound bites on the team, and that's not what they did here. I think they picked people who they are confident will represent the values Matt Rule is trying to instill.
Brandon, I'm sitting here and I'm still thinking about the whole Northwestern situation and knowing the locker room and going back to just what Kelly said, at SEC media days. How often is it, do you think, that a head coach doesn't know what's going on in his locker room?
That piece of it kind of strains credulity a little bit for me. I mean, I think they have an obligation to know, particularly with instances like those that are being described at Northwestern. But I think a big factor in this is, okay, so all three of us here played sports, at some level at some point in our lives. And I'm probably the oldest one here, almost certainly. Like, I remember, my freshman year of football in high school, like you walk into a totally new team and you're in 2 days, and these teams are kind of like their own little deserted islands, and that they have their own culture, and you're dealing with young people, and there are rituals and routines, and culture is constantly shifting. So like what may have been okay or even just allowed to happen when I was in that position was probably different than what it was for either of you, and at a different stage. And it can be hard, I think, to kind of keep up with culturally what is going to be accepted, but you have to. And I think it's particularly hard for coaches like Pat Fitzgerald, where what they have done has worked, at Northwestern for sure, and they've been there a long time. So you kind of get in this potential spot of stasis where it's like, well, what we're doing is working, so I don't want to make big broad changes, for that reason. And when you stay there a long time, I think you become a little bit more insulated to what is happening outside in culture more broadly, and that's where the friction, I think, can come.
Brandon, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I tend to agree with you that it is difficult to believe that that Pat Fitzgerald wasn't aware, at least to some degree, of what was going on. But I guess if we give him the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, he's telling us the truth here and didn't know, I guess to what degree do we hold him responsible in that sense of being either blissfully unaware or borderline negligent in not having a better grasp of what's going on in his locker room?
Yeah, I think there definitely would need to be some ramifications for that, because I also look at that, as borderline negligent.
Mhm.
And when we go back to this, like, that was kind of the initial report, right? Like the first thing that came out was and it wasn't like they hired kind of a law firm off of an ambulance chasing law firm. Like, this was a serious law firm that does this, and their findings. It even said it in the president's announcement of Fitzgerald's termination, that there's no evidence yet that Pat Fitzgerald knew of this. So the response to this really kind of escalated very, very quickly. And I think if all it's there about Fitzgerald's knowledge or involvement in this is what the facts that have been presented so far, that's probably not, in my opinion, for him or anybody else that was in a similar situation, maybe isn't a fireable offense. I would be willing, and I think this is kind of just my general setting, like, okay, we've this has come to light now. We know about it. Everybody knows about it. Let's give him an opportunity to rectify some things. But it's tough. I mean, it's a judgment call that somebody has to make, and Northwestern president did. And I don't know. I don't know if they wish they would have taken a little bit more time with it, but it seems like that's where things are headed.
We're talking to Brandon Vogel, managing editor for Hail Varsity, at Brandon L. Vogel on Twitter. B-Vogues, let's go to the Huskers here. How are they going to win in year one? Is it going to be predicated on defense or offense? Because so far this offseason, we've heard a ton about what the defense will look like, not if it will bring success like we saw last year at Syracuse. And also on the offensive side of things, we've heard very little to nothing about what that will look like.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think with the players that return on both sides of the ball, I tend to go into this season right now, thinking that defense is a little bit better off. When you look at a player like Reimer, you look at 4 starters back in the secondary. Defensive line is the area where you've got some question marks, but to whatever degree you want to put stock into spring football, I thought there were some encouraging signs there as well. So offensively, you're going to have a new quarterback. You've got some things to sort out at receiver. The O-line has a lot to prove. And running back room, I think, is pretty well stocked. That's kind of the broad lay of the land. So I think this then becomes offensively one of the ways I'll be trying to judge this offense early in the season. Can it stay on the field? Can it kind of consistently produce drives that, and some of this was by design, some of it was just by ineffectiveness, but with how Nebraska wanted to play offense, I think, you think of kind of the classic Scott Frost approach that we probably most remember from Central Florida. We never saw it get to those heights in Nebraska. It puts a strain on defenses. You're on the field a lot as a defense. And I think for Nebraska to win games in 2023, they'll need to control the clock, which doesn't always mean winning time of possession necessarily, but be able to control the flow offensively. And then let a defense that at Syracuse, at least under Tony White, was very active and produced a good number of havoc plays, kind of exploit the fact that it's not going to be asked to be on the field for 34, 35 minutes almost every Saturday. I think that's the simplest path.
Brandon, you touched on something there that kind of sent an alarm bell off in my head, and because we're previewing Illinois later today as part of the schedule breakdown, and what you said kind of rang in my head about staying on the field, kind of controlling time of possession, things like that, things that Illinois did really well last year. And then I remember, okay, we've got a rule change this year where the clock doesn't stop on first downs anymore until after we're in the last 2 minutes of a half. Is that something that you could see Nebraska maybe trying to use to their advantage in the way that they kind of structure how they play out games to, let's say the offensive line doesn't get where they want it to be and the receivers never really emerge the way they would need to kind of put things in a more manageable position for them? Is that something you could see this year?
I think so. It's funny, that rule change in particular with offensive coordinator Marcus Satterfield's, espoused love of the huddle, kind of potentially go hand in hand if you're invested in trying to keep your defense off the field, which I think most football teams are, unless they're just like super up tempo, super, high flying. So it gets interesting when you stop and think about it, of just say, okay, it's 1st and 10 from the 25 and you throw an 11-yard out, in the past clock stops. Now it doesn't. And Nebraska's probably going to huddle. They're not going to rush to the line. I'm sure they'll use pace at times as sort of a curveball or a weapon. But it does help those teams, and it makes the Big Ten super interesting because there are so many teams. It kind of becomes, unless you're Ohio State, I mean, we've seen Michigan win the conference the past 2 years with a very, very straightforward, like, be good on the lines, run the football, play defense approach. Has done it at a higher level than even kind of the usual suspects of Wisconsin, Iowa, Northwestern. I'd put Minnesota in that group too. And then we saw Illinois kind of join the fold of kind of classic football. And I think this clock change rule, which I don't personally like it because I want as much football as possible, it does help teams that are able to execute that type of approach.
Bogues, I'm happy you brought up Illinois because that's who we're talking about today. We've been doing schedule breakdowns all this week and last, and we get into the weeds with Illinois and Scott Ritchie this week, or today, I should say. But, I kind of want to ask you maybe a more leaning Illinois question here because of all they lost in the secondary, yet their defense is going to look completely different with Ryan Walters gone at Purdue. Do you think that's something that they can replicate? Last year's defense, maybe even the defense of a year before when they went 5-7, but under Brett Bielema, can it continue to replicate without Ryan Walters there?
Yeah, that's one thing that gives me a little bit of pause. I mean, I think the bigger one is probably just the sheer amount of talent lost in the secondary. And they're okay there. They're just not as proven. They're not going to have 3, first 2 days of the draft picks back there, I don't think. But they might have 2 on the defensive line, which will help in Jerzon Newton and Keith Randolph. They're going to be really good up front defensively. And, as we we're kind of talking about, this is, this is Brett Bielema's happy space. So they promoted from within to fill that open DC role. So I do think there's a good chance for continuity. I think they gave up less than 10 points a game last year. They're probably not going to hit that.
Yeah, it was like 12.8, I think.
12.8. Okay. I'd be surprised if they jumped all the way to say 22 or 24, though. I think this is still going to be a pretty good defense. And then, in terms of what they're able to put up offensively, obviously have a big hole at running back. And they'll be playing under a new quarterback too. So the margins get thinner for Illinois, but they are not a team that I think I could write off right now in the Big Ten West race based on anything we just discussed.
Yeah, they're only given 6.5 too as their over under win total, which I think is incredibly low.
Yeah, they've got a really manageable schedule.
Yeah, it's tough in the West. You get past Wisconsin and Illinois, and then it's just kind of a jumble of teams that are right there in between 5 and 7 for their win totals, and you kind of gotta. I mean, the Big Ten's always murky. In the last year of the Big Ten West, I think it's kind of perfectly murky, I guess is the term I'll go with.
Brandon, sticking with Illinois for a second here, and the job that Brett Bielema's done in his first couple of years on campus there, where do you put him in terms of, I guess, just the hierarchy of Big Ten coaches? Obviously, you've got probably Jim Harbaugh, Ryan Day right up there at the top. There's been a lot of turnover recently, especially in the West. Where does Bielema fit in there for you? Because between his track record at Wisconsin and now he appears to be basically replicating that at Illinois, it's hard not to put him, upper third.
Got to be top 5.
Yeah, I think I'll regret this when I have more time to think about it and realize I
love putting a guy on a spot like that.
But
let me write this down. Brandon Vogel will.
Yeah, I was going to say top 4, but I think top 5 is right. So Harbaugh, Day, yes. James Franklin, he's here. It gets a little murky for me, but I tend to put a ton of value in guys like Bielema, who has done it at multiple places, and even Arkansas.
Big Ten school.
Yeah. Even Arkansas had its moments. And was kind of a weird situation. Conference change is a big deal, of course, but has done it in Wisconsin, and he seems to be replicating it in Illinois. That counts for a lot for me. Kirk Ferentz doing it over the length of time. So I think that would probably be my top 5. And you could convince me of any jockeying basically below Harbaugh and Day between Franklin, Ferentz, and Bielema at this point.
Vogues, if you could flock to a position coach that you think has done the best job since he's arrived in Lincoln, who would that be and why? We heard mine on the Husker Radio Network last night.
The one I flocked to immediately off the top of my head is Garrett McGuire. I think he's been super impressive. And it seems that, the camaraderie that he's built with a group of players that is pretty interesting. When you look at Marcus Washington's probably your most proven option. You're bringing back 2 guys who used to be on the team, which could be, difficult to navigate. They've got a bunch of incoming freshmen. And then he's done really, really well, I feel, on the recruiting trail. That's been really, really impressive to me. Ed Foley kind of comes to mind too. He was a little bit of the star of the winter just with how much he's out there. But until we see, a little bit of special teams and what that actually looks like on the field, I'm gonna go with McGuire.
Brandon, I think I'm a Terrence Knighton guy. Am I crazy?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, that one gets really interesting too when you look at some of those young guys, and they're going to have to play just for depth. But in the spring game, they looked ready to play, which is incredibly impressive because that's a hard position. Maybe second only to offensive line, I think, for a true freshman or even redshirt freshman to be ready to go and log major stats just because, most of those guys coming out of high school aren't physically where they will be when they're sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So it's been that's a good call. I think that's pretty. He's done a good job.
Yeah, again, it's Evan Cooper for me. Just his ability to recruit and the way he pulls aside people at camps.
It's pretty encouraging that we have 3 different answers, though, and all of them seem like good answers, right?
Point. It's a great point.
Indeed, I would agree. It's been it'll be interesting to see if some Matt Rule's speaking at Texas high school football coaches convention or social event today. I'll be interested to see some of the comments from that. He had a fairly famous speech at that similar event while he was at Baylor, and Nebraska has quite a bit of attention on it down there at the moment.
Vogel, you've seen a lot of recruiting classes come and go at Nebraska over your time covering the team. What would you say is a good success rate out of the 24 hard commits in the 2024 class?
I think broadly, and I've looked at this over really since 2011. I kind of used the start of the Big Ten era as a cutoff point. Like, Nebraska has historically lost about 40 to 45% of its signing classes. So you just kind of start there.
Average? Is that pretty average?
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because it's tough to compile that much data for that many different schools, which is endlessly frustrating to me. I've often thought about during the summer, do I want to log all the hours to satisfy my own curiosity? And I haven't yet. But I think it's elevated because Nebraska has to recruit so nationally that I think some of it's just inherent to how they have to do things. I wrote about this a long time ago, but it was the highest in the Big Ten West at the time that I looked at it. Not drastically so, but it was the highest. And so I always start from there of like, okay, you have 24 guys, 11 of them probably aren't going to finish their career here. And that might be a good basic marker for this is that, we get 3-4 years down the road, are there only 8 players who may be left for reasons that were beyond either declaring early for the draft or exhausting their eligibility? Particularly with a kind of, it's not Rule's first class, but it's the first class he's been able to, take from start to finish. Those classes become really, really important in what happens over the next 4 or 5 years. And I think if you go back and look, if you can hold those classes together, it's a pretty big boost and pretty good sign of where the program is at those 4 or 5 years down the road. So I would start there with maybe let's get that attrition rate lower. And then if you do that, I think it's almost inevitable that either people are sticking around even if they're not playing because they really like the culture, or they're becoming contributors, which is, of course, the easiest way to reduce that attrition rate.
Brandon Vogel, we appreciate your time this morning, man. Thanks so much. Right. Always enjoy it. Have a great week.
You too, guys. Thanks.
That's B-Vogues at Brandon L. Vogel on Twitter. He's the managing editor for Hail Varsity. And you can get your Hail Varsity magazine or subscription, I should say, by using the promo code AR or DB when you sign up. You'll get some money off, and you'll get a team of great writers, Brandon Vogel included, that puts out pieces, the Husker content you're fiending for every day. And you can check that out, hailvarsity.com, or you can get the magazine. And you can sign up even at the restaurant at Hail Varsity Club. There's magazines on every table. You can even take the free copy home. So we appreciate Brandon Vogel. When we come back, let's do the Sports Six Pack.
All right.
Shane's beers are on ice.
Let's go.
He'll crack them open next.